When do civilian, and I put a question mark up there because at least I don't consider EMS personnel and firemen to actually be civilians, become involved in law enforcement operations? More specifically, law enforcement special operations, high-risk situations that could put them in the line of fire. My answer to this question, though, is frequently. Many paramedics will state that there is policy and procedure that precludes them from these activities. But it's interesting that in every single video that I've seen and newsreel that I've seen of the events of 9/11, it were firemen and paramedics like yourself that were running towards the Twin Towers and not away from them. Today we're going to address a concept called TCCC, Tactical Casualty Combat Care, which addresses in a tactical manner the most common causes of violence-related trauma leading to death. Now, please don't be confused. This is not a law enforcement program. This is for traditional EMS and firefighters. Nobody will be shooting any guns, but you may find yourself in a situation where weapons have been fired and people have been hurt by those weapons. These techniques were developed based on our military's experiences over the last decade in Iraq and Afghanistan. The concept was actually first thought about after Mogadishu. They are just as applicable to domestic mass casualty events as they are to armed military combat. These events include mass shootings and active shooter events. Anybody who watches the news knows this is happening more and more frequently. And natural disasters as well. Tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, all of these techniques can be employed. Let's first talk about the most common causes of preventable combat death. And I say combat death, any death brought on by some type of violent act is what I'm talking about. Extremity hemorrhage, bleeding to death. That's the most frequent cause. 60% of the deaths are caused by extremity hemorrhage. If you look at traditional EMS and focus on airway, breathing, and circulation, if you were to apply CPR to a person that had been shot, you'd only be pumping blood out of them through their gunshot wound. Next is tension pneumothorax, which takes the lives of 33% of casualties, and then airway obstruction, 6%. The fate of the wounded lays with those who apply the first dressing. I tell this to every one of my SWAT operators because they may be applying the first dressing either to themselves or each other. And you as EMS and paramedic trained firemen may be the ones that are applying the first dressings to the wounded. Not a doctor, not a surgeon, but you. TCCC, Tactical Combat Casualty Care, is not traditional EMT, EMS care. It was developed by the Department of Defense. It's recognized by both the American College of Surgeons and the National Association of EMTs. This is very significant because these two groups hardly ever agree on anything. It focuses on penetrating trauma. The emphasis is on completion of the mission, stopping ongoing violence and protecting other innocents in the area. Completion of the mission for EMS in a mass casualty scenario is to care for the wounded immediately with basic life-saving skills only, and then conduct safe movement of the wounded to a secure area for follow-on traditional care. Are active shooters still an issue after Columbine? Absolutely. March 2012, Oakland, California, 7 dead in a high school. Jared Lee Lohner has been identified as the man suspected of shooting Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords. Lohner was described by eyewitnesses at the Arizona shooting as a young white man who looked like a fringe character in his mid to late 20s, clean shaven with short hair and wearing dark clothing. It's usually after the shooting that they look suspicious or different. There is no profile or look for a shooter. Longner was quickly arrested after he allegedly shot Giffords and some 12 others at a public event at a Safeway grocery store in Tucson, Arizona. He reportedly shot the Congresswoman point blank in the head and may have come from inside the store. He attempted to flee after running out of ammunition, but was tackled by one of Gifford's staffers. Another 8 dead in Carthage, North Carolina at a nursing home shooting in March of 2009. A lone gunman burst into a North Carolina nursing home Sunday morning and started shooting everything, barging into rooms of terrified patients, sparing some from his rampage without explanation, while killing 7 residents and a nurse that was caring for them. 2 incidents in Harnett County, North Carolina. One, a 13-year-old was killed in a confrontation with a Harnett County deputy January 19, 2010. Next, a Harnett County Sheriff's deputy was shot in the leg during an incident with a suspect outside of a supermarket convenience store. If you look at slide 13, you can read the details of December 10, 2009. A Virginia student was charged in a school shooting. But the frustrating part was that no one really knew what they were supposed to do, said Michelle Witkoff, 43 years old, who was sitting in a sociology classroom on the 3rd floor of the building when the shooting began on the floor above. She said she didn't hear the shots, but was soon alerted by another student who entered the classroom and let her know what was going on. She thought, do we wait here? Do we stay? Do we run out of the building? Ms. Witkoff said, we had no idea. We had no idea. She also had no idea of what to do with the injured that were laying right in front of her. In yet another extremely high-profile active shooting, April 16, 2007, the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, Blacksburg, Virginia. At least 33 people were shot to death at Virginia Tech, including a gunman who took his own life. That gunman is blamed for at least 30 deaths and 15 injuries inside an engineering building. And if you'll read slide 16, you'll see yet another mass casualty incident, July 22nd, 2011, in Norway, both a shooting and a bomb attack. If you'll notice from all of these slides, there is no pattern of pinpointed geographical locations of any of these incidents. No predictable pattern of who is targeted. Understand and know that it can happen in your jurisdiction. Now, what are the goals of tactical combat casualty care? First, treat the casualty. Treat your teammates and treat yourself. Whoever needs treated, you treat. Prevent additional casualties. And then complete the mission. Give care to the victims. In contrast to traditional EMS care, in TCCC, you are working very quickly from one victim to another, providing only immediate life-saving care. Then move to the next victim. Any follow-on care or aid or monitoring comes in another phase of care. To be successful, there are some very basic equipment differences between traditional EMS gear and that needed for tactical combat casualty care. An example would be a traditional gurney found on an ambulance versus a tactical foxtrot litter, as you can see here, or drag straps that could be quickly utilized to move victims from a point of fire to a point of safety. Are EMTs, paramedic, or traditional medical first responders going to be wearing ballistic protection? Likely not. However, there are vests made for EMS and paramedics and a variety of other first responders where gear can all be placed up front on the responder so that it's quickly accessible. Take, for instance, my personal tourniquet and my ballistic blowout kit. The difference between the SWAT vest that I'm wearing and the vest that the paramedic or EMS first responder would be wearing would be that there wouldn't be the 30-round magazines for my M4, but there would be 6 to 7 tourniquets placed across the front of my body, plus 2 blowout kits on either side or on my back, so that I can immediately go to work from victim to victim, as we discussed earlier. The ballistic kits that I mentioned earlier that would be on either side of the paramedic's vest may look something like this. These are excellent blowout kits for a gunshot wound. You've got dressings, tape, shears, hemostatic agents, nasal airways, and occlusive dressings, all in one pack that's easily accessible to the operator. Remember that as a paramedic or medical first responder, all of your ballistic care kits will be up front so that they can be reached with either hand in any given position that you have to give care from. The Ballistic Response Pack contains essential first response medical gear for dealing with gunshot wounds. It's designed for ease of use, ease of movement, and fast administration of that medical equipment necessary to deal with a gunshot wound. It's geared to treat the 3 leading preventable causes of combat trauma or violent death. That is, unless it's not carried or it's not maintained. But please don't let me confuse you, because I just talked about all of your gear and equipment being up front. And that will work for the first 3 to 4 gunshot wound victims you encounter. Next, you could have this backpack on that contains all of the same gear that you've got on up front, just in greater quantities. Wound bandages, hemostatic agents, chest decompression needles, chest seals, tourniquets, and nasal airways, just in greater quantities carried on the back. To be clear, this medical backpack is actually worn on the back of the paramedic going into the mass casualty scene. It is there to supplement the equipment that that operator has on their front, as we discussed earlier. Let me one more time cover the most common causes of preventable combat death before we talk about their treatments and solutions: extremity hemorrhage, tension pneumothorax, and airway obstruction. What we will talk about for the remainder of this program are the specific pieces of equipment that you, the individual paramedic, will carry to address these types of injuries. It is not my intention to teach you how or when to do these procedures, but only to address the equipment needed. First responders need to take a certifying TCCC course prior to performing these procedures. Extremity hemorrhage. It's just a flesh wound. Remember the Black Knight from Monty Python's Holy Grail? Gunshot wounds cause extremity hemorrhage, as well as edged weapon damage and explosives. Extremity hemorrhage will likely be the most common wounds you will see and deal with when responding to a mass casualty incident brought on by a violent suspect or a terrorist attack. The extremity hemorrhage assessment. Where is the wound? Larger vessels are closer to the torso and bleed more. Vessels decrease in size as they approach the hands and feet. Everything in the neck is close to major vessels. Forehead and scalp are full of superficial vessels, lots of blood, but easy bleeding to stop. Once you've located the wound, keep in mind that a streaming fountain of blood is a bad thing. It indicates arterial bleeding and must be stopped. It will be bright red in color. A steady stream is likely venous bleeding. It will be slower and it will be dark red. The reason I mention the these basic medical facts to you highly trained professionals is because it pertains to the kind of fast, non-traditional tactical care you, the first responder, will be administering versus slow, deliberate, traditional EMS field care. An example is the immediate use of a tourniquet. General treatment for an extremity hemorrhage. Seek cover, remain tactical, and be defensive. Not something you hear very often, is it? Locate the wound. Expose the wound. Are there one or multiple wounds? Is there an entry or exit wound? And assess your trauma kit for what you're going to need. Now I go back to seek cover, remain tactical, and defensive. You may be giving this care while laying in a defensive position versus being able to take your time, standing up, moving the victim so that it's easier for you to deal with. For instance, on a gurney and then the gurney up in the air. You may be laying on the ground with the victim to help ensure your safety and his or hers. Extremity hemorrhage direct treatments. This is the modular bandage packaged. And slide 27 shows the modular bandage opened. Now let's talk about the modular bandage features. It's a self-contained elastic bandage with gauze inside of it, a pressure cup to apply pressure to the wound after you apply this bandage, and an occlusive dressing. It's sterile, so don't open until you're ready to use it. It has no hemostatic agent, like quick clot gauze, for example, and it is used for mild abrasions to severe bleeding. One of the features that I like best about this particular bandage is the fact that the bandaging material is Velcroed, so that when you go to apply it, it's not rolling off away from you. If you look at slide 29, the same modular bandage that we just looked at is being applied in a very real-world situation. As you all, as medical professionals, well know, once this bandage has been applied correctly, the role of direct pressure remains the same as it has for centuries. It may be applied with any material to slow bleeding. A sterile product is best, but not always available in a given violent situation. It will control bleeding in most cases. This modular bandage, when applied properly, provides direct pressure, and elevation is also helpful. Keep in mind, equipment has changed and evolved over the centuries. The human body hasn't. The advantage to this modular bandage is that it is all in one pack, eliminating the need for dragging or packing and then unpacking unnecessary equipment into a fast-moving scene or environment. Again, the modular bandage can be used to treat abrasions, burns, and shallow lacerations. For an extremity hemorrhage that could not be controlled with direct pressure or a modular bandage, we have the tourniquet. In a mass violent situation, these tactical tourniquets give you greater flexibility and are quicker to use than traditional EMS tourniquets. Advantages include the tourniquet not slipping off while the patient may be being transported roughly from one point of cover to another before getting to a triage area. The tourniquet should be placed in specific areas of the arm and legs, which you will be taught when you go to a TCCC certifying course. Tighten to the point that the bleeding stops. If the bleeding hasn't stopped, add a second tourniquet above the first, but do not release the pressure or remove the first tourniquet. These are used routinely in orthopedic extremity surgeries. Today, traditional EMS still shies away from the use of a tourniquet. But let me talk about Officer Kimberly Munley. You may know her name. She is the officer who shot the Fort Hood shooter. But what many people don't realize is that Officer Munley was also shot through the upper leg. Her femoral artery was completely severed. A young soldier who had just been to his pre-deployment training for Iraq had a tourniquet in his pocket at the time of the shooting. He came up and placed that on Officer Munley in the proper manner. He then leaned Officer Munley up against a wall. Officer Munley received no further medical attention, not even an "are you okay?" for 47 minutes. Officer Munley today runs, does CrossFit, and continues to serve her community. Again, as medical professionals, you may already know this, but just as a review, a tourniquet would be used when bleeding is uncontrollable with direct pressure and elevation, if there's an amputation or arterial bleeding from major vessels, such as the femoral artery in the thigh or the brachial artery in the upper arm. And of course, it's these type of wounds that we are all much more likely to see in an incidence of mass violence. Tourniquets are extremely effective when needed, and the benefits far outweigh the risks. Use a Sharpie to record the tourniquet time on the patient, or at least write it down somewhere. Let's talk about the second most common cause of preventable combat or violence-related death, the tension pneumothorax, collapsed lung. Pneumothorax is air trapped between the outside surface of the lung and the chest wall. Tension pneumothorax occurs when this air creates enough pressure to cause the lung to collapse. This can also squeeze the heart, contributing to death. Again, you're medical professionals. You know the causes of a tension pneumothorax. Now think about this one. Blunt trauma can be forceful enough to create a gap between the lung and the chest wall. How could this occur in a mass violence situation? Blast pressure, or the overpressure created by an explosion. There may have been a large explosion at your mass casualty incident, and you come across a victim laying down on the ground with no visible cuts, scratches, amputations, yet they're down there. Blast trauma can cause a collapsed lung, as well as penetrating traumas, improperly treated chest wounds, and CPR chest compressions. Tension pneumothorax, again, with no penetrating chest wound that could have been caused by the overpressure from an explosive during the situation you've arrived to, will cause some shortness of breath after a hard blow or the hard blow from the overpressure to the chest and back. And as the slide shows, with any penetrating chest wound or chest trauma, you can expect a tension pneumothorax. Chest wound treatments. You want to properly dress the wound to lessen the chances of a tension pneumothorax. Frequently check the patients for signs of a tension pneumothorax. Do they have shortness of breath? Is the trachea moving away from the wounded side? This is called tracheal deviation. Properly dressing a chest wound could include an occlusive dressing. Remember what came in our modular bandage? This works as an occlusive dressing. Or you can use an actual chest seal designed to treat these types of injuries. Again, you want it to be airtight from outside to inside. You can use the plastic sheet from the modular bandage. You could use petroleum gauze, and you need just a little bit of tape. When the wound is dressed, it is imperative to watch the patient breathe. If you use the occlusive dressing found in the modular bandage, you want to tape up 3 sides of it to allow just a little bit of air to escape. If a tension pneumothorax develops, needle decompression is the initial treatment. An 18 to 14 gauge needle on the affected side placed between the first and second ribs at the mid-clavicular line or the collarbone. First, let's take a look at slide number 45 to look at what we call the needle decompression landmarks so that you'll better understand where the needle is placed. For the tension pneumothorax needle decompression procedure, first you will expose the chest. If you can, clean it with alcohol. Find the landmarks that you can see on slide 45. Insert the needle sliding over the top of the rib. Listen for air to evacuate the chest. Remove the needle and leave the catheter. The procedures and guidelines for dealing with a tension pneumothorax are no different than those you already know. It's that in a mass casualty incident, you can expect to see numerous tension pneumothorax or chest penetrating injuries. You may run into this frequently as you're at the scene. Now let's talk about the third most common cause of combat or a violence-related death, airway obstruction. Simple obstructions include bleeding, soft tissue injury, the tongue, but all of this can be handled with a nasopharyngeal airway. The nasopharyngeal airway, the number one thing is to use lots of lubrication. Place the bevel to the center, usually using the right nostril but away from the trauma. Insertion direction is straight towards the back of the head. You may need to switch the nostril if there's a lot of resistance given. And again, I remind you to use lots of lubrication. And most of these devices come with some type of lubricating jelly with them for the application. The reason you'll want to carry multiple nasopharyngeal airways is that during a mass casualty incident or situation, they're much smaller and lighter, and many more of them can be carried and applied than other ways of opening an airway. Now remember, we're talking about tactical medical kits, which you may not use every day. So always keep yourself familiar and trained with the contents of your tactical or mass casualty medical kit. Practice applying tourniquets. It's not a skill that EMS uses all that often. Check your medical kit regularly. Replace lost, used, or expired items. Again, this is stuff you know to do, but if you don't use this pack on a regular basis, you have to have some type of schedule set up to ensure that this is done so that when the day comes and you need it, it's there for you. And again, place your gear where you can reach it in a tactical situation. Think about the difference in the ways you may be applying your medical skills from a call to a residence where no violence has occurred to a call in a school where a lot of violence has occurred. I know I'm telling you to get new gear, but it's not that expensive. Everything that I've shown you in combination is probably right at under $1,000. Always remember that your best medical kit is your tactical medical training, your readiness, and your physical and mental conditioning when the day comes that you have to respond to an incident of mass violence. Eventually, you will have to use this equipment. Don't be afraid to use it. You will save yourself or another from a worse injury or death. You're going to work with law enforcement. In many mass casualty situations, you will have to coordinate treatment, movement, and rescue efforts with law enforcement. You might be moving as part of or integrated in with an armed law enforcement team to get to the victims that you need to treat. A brief overview of these tactics will follow. Keep in mind, at a mass casualty scene, when I state that you'll be moving with armed officers, this will happen even after the scene's been deemed cleared, secured, safed, whatever the case may be, or the word used may be. Armed law enforcement will still be out and about pulling 360-degree security to ensure your safety while you're doing your job. The types of situations that you might find yourself involved with armed law enforcement officers include an active shooter at a school, an active shooter at a business, a hostage rescue operation by law enforcement, injured, downed officer or civilian, and others to include bank robberies, home invasions, methamphetamine labs. Any dangerous situation that law enforcement responds to, we all know that you respond to as well. Let's talk about the police response priorities. The first one is to locate, isolate, and stop the shooter. But once this is done, that's when you, the first responder medical professional, gets involved to treat and evacuate the injured. You are part of priority number 2. We will establish containment, we will do safety sweeps, we will help complete evacuations, and eventually the crime scene will be processed as a last priority. The police response elements that you'll be working with and around include contact teams whose job it is to go in and isolate, stop, or neutralize the threat, rescue teams that you as medical professionals will be a part of, perimeter teams that as you're coming into the scene, you'll deal with and interact with, and then evacuation teams that will bring casualties out to you if you're running the triage center. The movement goals of law enforcement are to immediately locate the threat, a movement to contact, isolate that threat, and then confront, neutralize, or apprehend the suspect. Multiple officer movement teams consist of 2 to 4 officers, 4 being the best case scenario, in a diamond formation, which provides 360-degree security. No room entry will be made unless the suspect is located, and they will use the proper movement speeds. Look at slide number 57, the diamond formation, with a point man, 2 wings, and a rear guard. Next, we're going to talk about a rescue team and what your role in this diamond formation is. Now let's look at the rescue team. This is the team that you'll be a part of. You, as a first responder, paramedic, or medical professional, will be surrounded by 4 armed officers. You'll have a front guard, 2 wings, and a rear guard, with yourself placed safely at the center of the formation to move up to the wounded and provide immediate medical care. The goals of this rescue team are as follows: locate the injured, provide immediate and quick treatment to the injured, and then to follow on injured, triage, and then evacuation if necessary. And I think from looking at the diagram, it becomes very apparent why the kit you carry needs to be small and compact. You can't really put a 200-pound gurney in the middle of this formation and quickly move up a staircase. That's why the equipment we're showing you goes on a backpack or a front-mounted medical-type assault vest. Your one job during movement to the injured is to just maintain the same flow that the team is maintaining in order to get to the injured. Once you're at the injured, these armed officers will provide the security that you need to comfortably do your job. Keep in mind that you'll be triaging and dealing with multiple injuries within a law enforcement perimeter. Keep in mind that in a mass casualty situation created by violence, you will likely be working alone, whereas you're typically used to working with a partner, and you're going to have a different mindset about what you're doing. We call it a tactical mindset. And there is training available to both paramedics and law enforcement about tactical mindset. I would highly recommend taking one. I would also recommend, before you go to one of these real incidents and you're staring face to face with law enforcement wondering what to do, go meet your local law enforcement officers. Go out for one day and watch the SWAT team train. Offer to support them in their training by just being there with an ambulance and getting to know them. That will make the day of the incident much better for everybody involved. And keep in mind that while you're out in the triage and evacuation area, the perimeter team is doing a very necessary job keeping you safe. But they're also trying to reach their law enforcement goals with a perimeter, which is 1, to shrink the perimeter, 2, provide a safe area for the evacuation of the injured, 3, cut off any suspect escape routes, and 4, allow for the safe evacuation for all of and/or a portion of whatever building is involved in your mass casualty incidents of violence. From the time of call out to an incident of mass violence, keep a tactical mindset. You are going into a hot zone. Have your head on a swivel and always pay attention to detail. You might see or observe something law enforcement missed or has not seen yet based on their positioning versus your positioning at the scene. Don't hang around exposed to possible gunfire. Seek cover and concealment until it's time to move as part of a law enforcement rescue team or into a secure triage area. Law enforcement cannot possibly deal with these scenes without you. We are all one team.